Hello everyone, how's your day going? That sucks. Or possibly it's really good. I can't actually hear you, but I thank you very much for taking some time out of your day and joining me for this episode of the Normcast. Settle in, make yourself comfortable, forget about the cares of the day, clear out some space in your brain for some brand new cares instead. In tonight's episode, we're going to be talking about something that I have a bit of an interest in, that being virtual reality. More specifically, virtual reality, why it really has not hit the point of mass market adoption yet, and what it needs to do so. As anyone who knows me can tell you, I am quite a bit of a VR enthusiast. I love the technology, I like the hardware. I am frequently ambivalent about the software, but I do sincerely feel that when all the pieces are in motion together in the proper configuration, when everything is hitting the sweet spot, virtual reality provides an experience that nothing else can match. Sony very recently has released the PSVR2, the successor to the PlayStation 4's VR headset. It is in almost every way a technological leap above the previous generation. It's got higher resolution, simpler interface, the controllers are much improved over the terrible motion tracking reuse PS Move controllers of the PSVR1. The hardware has made what are pretty much all the right moves. Well, there's one major problem with it, I'll get into that later. But the hardware, in its role of improving over the previous design, is leaps and bounds beyond its predecessor. And that being the case, one may wonder why, in this week or so after the launch, this miracle of technological design has landed with all the fanfare of a dried-up frog carcass. Actually, that's not even a fair comparison because a little kid could actually muster up some real excitement about a dried-up frog carcass, whereas the PSVR2 has just sort of faded into existence. Nobody seems particularly angry about it being there, but even Sony themselves seems to have a hard time mustering up any real enthusiasm for the equipment. As a PSVR1 owner myself, I can tell you that at the about midlife of the PSVR1, I was really looking forward to the PSVR2 as fulfilling a lot of the mass market promises of the VR platform. The PlayStation VR1 had a huge advantage over a number of the other popular VR systems, the ones on PC. I was going to name another one, but no, at the time it was mostly just PC. The Quest really had not risen to any prominence at that point, so standalone VR was not really a viable competitor. But the PlayStation VR made some very significant strides towards making VR more accessible in a functional format to the general public. The PlayStation 4 had a massive install base. The price point for the PSVR 1 was, not great, but at the same time, it was functional. Most people who had an interest in it could scrape together enough to buy in. And buying in got you a headset that was reasonable quality for what you paid. It was an OLED screen, beautiful colors on it. The tracking was external, and it was okay, I can't be kind here. The tracking kind of sucked. It was utilizing the PS Move controllers, and I don't know if you know what the PS Move controllers are if you're not familiar with the VR experience. These were actually released kind of the PlayStation answer to the Wii controllers, the motion controllers. Sticks with big, glowing ping pong balls on top of them that you held in your hands and waved around, and an external camera would track the motion of those. The tracking functionality for the PSVR 1 was not made for PSVR. It actually was for a completely separate system, the PS Move, which I think ended up getting like 5 games to support it and was quickly and quietly buried because it really was no good. There's no way to say definitively that the PS Move controllers were married to the PSVR system, specifically because they ended up with a massive backlog of them in their warehouse, but if that did turn out to be the case, I don't think there's a lot of people who would question it. So yeah, PSVR tracking had a lot of issues and dead spots, but it worked well enough for the caliber of games that were made for that first system. And the first wave of PSVR1 VR games did actually have some fairly impressive entries for an initial lineup. The real standout was probably Sony's own Astrobot Rescue Mission, a VR platformer that I cannot believe they have not ported to the new PSVR system, because it was a really solid showcase for what the technology could do, for the sense of presence, for a technical demonstration of what you could achieve with some creativity and the VR platform. But we'll get into the whole porting situation later here. It also shipped with VR Worlds, PlayStation VR Worlds, which was essentially an old school demo disc with, I think, 4 different demonstrations, an underwater one. I think there was like a street luge. The standout there was a very cinematic heist simulator. The name escapes me now, but it actually ended up kind of being the precursor to the later PSVR game, Blood and Truth. And there was also Arkham VR, a number of other promising VR titles, not in and of themselves scratching the itch for like a fully fledged VR game, but showing you what they could do with the technology, what a full game could be. And so for all the technical quirks of the PSVR1, the initial impressions of the system were pretty much unbounded promise. You were getting these little bite-sized tech demos to start with, these little VR experiences, but when they finally started cranking out the full-fledged VR games, you knew it was going to be something special. And so there was a steady trickle of games releasing for the VR side of the system. It was never pushed that heavily by Sony, which was understandable, because we are talking about a segmented user base that was, even under the most favorable circumstances, still just going to be a fraction of the active PS4 user base. But the building blocks were there so that once the big game releases came out, once you actually had that killer app, the AAA VR releases that would capture the national attention, you would have that traction to build up the VR user base into a much more closely merged Venn diagram of PS4 users. And so time marched on. We bided our times by playing what VR games were available on the storefront. They weren't bad games. On the whole, most of the VR releases were fairly compelling, but they all had the same kind of smallness about them. On-rail shooters, single-room experiences. There was at one point a VR release of Skyrim, which was obviously open world, but it was as bare bones a VR conversion as you can get. The whole thing was a missed opportunity so far as any kind of motion controls beyond combat. Like in the original Skyrim, when you mined ore, you'd press a button near an ore deposit and you would get an animation of your character mining the ore, whereas in the VR version, where you'd think that this would really be a no-brainer so far as implementing a motion-controlled interaction where you would actually take the pickaxe and hit the ore, that doesn't happen. You just activate the ore and the materials are added to your inventory. You don't even get an animation. So basically the entire lifespan of the PSVR1, we were waiting for the big game that was designed ground up to take control of, to take advantage of the VR platform, the motion controls, the sense of place, and it just never happened. Even Blood and Truth, which was a Sony first-party production built from the ground up for VR, ended up being a stage-based, closed environment, not exactly on rails, but definitely extremely linear shooter. In fact, far from fulfilling the promise of the PSVR World's heist demo, Blood and Truth actually had a noticeable graphical downgrade from the previous one, most likely due to the larger environments and the accompanying memory and processing drain. By the middle of the PSVR 1's life cycle, it was becoming apparent that we weren't going to get the killer app on this platform. There were too many technical hurdles in addition to the fractured user base. The PlayStation 4 was obviously not designed with VR in mind. VR, if you're not familiar with how VR is rendered, VR requires significantly more resources than standard 2D gaming. Besides a minimum requisite, and this is just absolute bare floor minimum, of 60 frames a second, that 60 frames has to be rendered twice, an effective 120 FPS frame rate on the base level, and then rendered at the highest resolution possible to accommodate the fact that your user's eyeballs are literally right next to the screen. In fairness, it's a miracle that VR works at all, even especially on like standalone devices like the Quest, because it is so resource intensive, but your average video gamer doesn't turn to the VR game that just made them puke out of motion sickness and then pat it on the head and say, good try, have an 85 Metascore. As a result, from the midlife of the PSVR1 on, a lot of hopes were pinned to the PSVR2 with the promise that a lot of these issues would be addressed. And yet... Okay, so I don't think anybody has the patience to sit through a half-hour lecture on this, so the short version is that the PSVR2 has arrived with much better hardware, but nearly the exact same inadequate marketing and development strategies. When it was first announced, Horizon Call of the Mountain looked like it was going to be addressing quite a few of the concerns with the user base in regards to the lack of high-budget, open-ended, AAA action exploration gameplay. And yet, on launch, it has turned out to be effectively another Blood and Truth. It's high quality for what's there, but the gameplay is not open-ended. It is not anywhere near representative of the freedom of gameplay that people are looking for in a VR experience. Additionally, of the 47 games that have been announced for the PlayStation VR in its launch window, all but 7 of those are already available on other platforms. Now, normally that wouldn't be a big deal. That would still, by most standards, be considered a pretty healthy lineup, but the problem is that the price point and the marketing of the PSVR2 is pretty much targeting VR enthusiasts, people who already are intimately familiar with the VR ecosystem. That means that unlike a typical console launch where a lot of these third-party games would still be moderate surprises because you wouldn't have encountered them elsewhere, for VR enthusiasts, it's still a moderately small market, and these are people who are intimately clued in to the ecosystem. They already know about all those games, and if they had any passing interest in them, I practically guarantee you they've already played them. Of the remaining PlayStation VR exclusives, you've got Call of the Mountain, and then you've got stuff like VR modes for Resident Evil or Gran Turismo. Make no mistake, this is good, any content is good, but nothing done so far addresses the major problems with the PSVR, with VR in general, breaking through to the mass audiences. Obviously, it doesn't fall entirely on Sony's shoulders to carry that particular burden. In fact, as much as I wish I could entrust it to a more worthy entity, it looks like Meta has actually made the strongest inroads towards that goal. But if the desired end result is mass adoption, as it should be, more people buying in equals more revenue streams, then company strategies need to be geared towards tackling the actual challenges that are facing VR. The first and largest one still being cost. We're a good 8 years or more out from the introduction of what I would consider new wave commercial VR, and yet headset costs really have not dropped at all. In fact, in most cases, they have increased. Now, this is going to be one of the harder ones to resolve because these cost increases are not necessarily because the companies just want to fill the money bin. Component and manufacturing costs have risen just like everything else, and while a large number of hardware manufacturers have willingly engaged in aggressive pricing to the point that they would actually take a loss on initial hardware sales, this is generally only done with the promise of recouping costs on software. And I think that if Sony's current strategy is telling us nothing else, it's that they are seeing the virtual side as a risky proposition. Even so, cost remains the biggest roadblock to VR adoption because there is a significant portion of the population who literally just has not tried VR yet, or has such limited interaction with it that their only impression is coming from like 30 seconds in VR chat, which is about long enough to give you a simulated venereal disease. VR is still not a sure thing for anyone but the enthusiasts, and that means that the price point needs to get down to take a chance pricing. Whether that ultimately translates to creating a lower cost additional version of the headset with perhaps slightly lower resolution or refresh LCD screens instead of LED. The Xbox Series X has proven that a lower cost version that does kind of the same thing does make a significant impact in market share. It may very well be time for a Series S of VR headsets. After that, it's the software. And this is part of where we get into the vicious circle of VR software development, because no third party is going to want to take the time and effort to develop the kind of games that VR needs to grow with the current installed base. That's why games like Call of the Mountain are such a big deal, is because first-party VR games are going to be the only ones that are not developed specifically to the limitations of their expected revenue streams. If a company like Ubisoft makes a VR game, it is not going to put any more into the development than it thinks it's going to get out. That's the big reason that even now VR games are largely trapped within the realm of VR quote-unquote experiences, small, linear, on rails. They're being developed specifically to what the current VR user base can support, because that money is the only money they're ever going to see from that particular game. So it falls to companies like Sony, who are creating the hardware, who are going to be benefiting from not just the sales of the initial software, but all software, to step up and create the games that should be on the platform. Stuff that's going to turn the head not just of the existing VR enthusiasts, but of the market in general, something that actually will sell a system. Unfortunately, it does not look like they're doing that. In point of depressing fact, it actually looks like they're treating this with about the same level of care as they did the PS Vita. Hopefully, I'm wrong. Anyway, I've talked about this long enough, and if you're not interested in VR, I'm sorry. Though I thank you for sticking around this long. Also, get interested in VR. VR's really neat. I use my headset on the daily, believe it or not, more for social applications than straight games, though I do a game on it. But VR is a remarkably good way to connect with people who are not in person, because it does give you that sense of place, that feeling of interaction with another individual in the same room. Although, don't do VR chat. That's a cesspool. Anyway, let's close this thing out with a couple more weird facts. Fact number 1. Did you know that in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, doctors used to construct bandages for their patients using spider webs? That's right, it turns out that spider webbing actually has natural antifungal and antiseptic properties, and thus actually does help when applied to wounds. Of course, there's also the chance that that's just a lucky coincidence and the ancient Roman doctors just wanted to cover their patients in spiders. In any case, if you're out playing with your friends and one of them does suffer an injury, it's a good idea to be ready to shove them into the nearest spider web. They'll thank you through the screaming. Finally, did you know that the common name bonobo, as in the bonobo monkey, is actually a misspelling? That is correct. It harkens back to a misspelled label on a shipping crate containing one of the animals that had been sent out from Bolobo, Zaire. And because it is established procedure to just take any misspelled monkey name and run with it, as demonstrated famously with Donkey Kong, which was originally supposed to be titled Monkey Kong, we just kept that bit of misspelled monkey libel in the standard lexicon. After all, what are the monkeys gonna do? Rise up and take over the planet? As if. Anyway, thank you very much for watching to the end of the video. If you enjoyed today's video, then please like, subscribe, hit the notifications button, leave a comment to show that you're engaged with the content. Alternately, just give us some money. You can do that at www.patreon.com/spookingtons. We are ready and willing at a moment's notice to accept your cash. Until next time, this is Norm saying, y'all take care. Like the video gamers? We have more such wonders to show you, and all you have to do is subscribe and hit the notifications button.
I mean, you don't have to.
Also consider becoming a patron by following the link to our Patreon page, where we turn your cash into videos, comics, and games using the darkest of dark magics.
But mostly just cash.